Welcome everybody to another episode. Very special guest, Dillian. He is partner at Founders Fund, co-founder of Varda. They're doing some really cool stuff with space manufacturing. Dillian, I don't know if I missed anything from your background or anything like that you want to add on.
Just two of the, sort of many jobs that I have in life, including being a young father.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yes, we definitely wanna touch on that because you tweet a lot or whatever we call it now. It's a lot about
X
being a
jobs.
dad and how much you love it, and I definitely wanna talk about that.
So I thought we could kick it off. So our audience is mostly like first time founders, and I thought that'd be really, and one of the reasons I pinged you to get you on is because you have a really interesting perspective, like starting as a VC and then co-founding a company. And I think that as a VC, like my first question I wanted to kind of kick it off with was what do you wish other founders knew from your perspective as a VC at Founders Fund?
I think a critical part of my answer to that question, relates to maybe, a portion of my professional career that we didn't touch on, which is even the
Yeah.
way that I got into venture was the fact that I actually started my first company, Nightingale. It was in the, sort of digital healthcare space, focused on behavioral and speech therapy and was primarily used for children with early childhood autism therapy. Um, and my answer to that question in some ways is what I wish I had known when I was starting that first company, which was that I think founders should have a very sort of strong thesis and answer as to why they're sort of best suited in the world to go pursue the problem that they're going after. And I don't think I had a very strong answer to that in my sort of first startup. It was something that I sort of, the problem space I kind of stumbled into. I was sort of following the lean startup approach in some ways, which was the like, iterate your way towards a market, A/B test, talk to customers to figure out what they need, et cetera.
Mhm.
And I think that was sort of the mantra in the like mid 2010s on like, sort of how to, sort of how to build a startup. It was the, do things that don't scale, sort of iterate quickly, listen to customers, et cetera. And it's not to say that there are like people that have, sort of had success in that approach, but I'm not sure that some of the biggest companies in the world were built that way. I think some of the biggest companies in the world were built in the what I call the, borrowing this analogy from my former and, or current still mentor, Keith Raboy, which is the sort of like
Yeah.
Hollywood style approach to, sort of building startups, which is in Hollywood, they don't A/B test scripts. They don't A/B test actors, right? They,
Right.
come up, with a predisposed, sort of vision of the world and a script. They then determine who are the best, basically actors that suit the vision, basically of that script. They go produce the whole thing, and then they ship it off to the world, and they make sort of lots of revenue off of that. And in some ways, the best startups actually look the same way, where a founder has a very strong predisposed view of the world. There's a reason
Right.
why that they should be the sort of lead actor, and they go build that vision without any concern in some ways for sort of what the sort of world sort of thinks of that vision. It's not to say that you're not going to take into account, what the market sort of feedback is, but you come into it with this very sort of strong and predisposed vision rather than being at the whims of the market. And so I think the thing that I wish sort of more founders sort of thought about is before you march onto this sort of 5, 10, 15 year long journey of building a company, you should make sure you have a really strong answer as to why. And the inflection point in some ways in my career where this sort of really came up was not even just the first company, which, ultimately ended up, we went through the Y Combinator, we got to like tech profitability,
Yep.
to like, and it's not a lot, but it was like, we got to like 150K ARR. It was enough to like, sort of, pay for 2 engineers, and me and my co-founder, on, pretty broke
Chipotle
out.
burrito.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah. I definitely like, I had to, couldn't even afford Chipotle. I had to buy groceries and cook for myself every day. That was the only way I could afford to, sort of live in San Francisco and work on the company. But where it really came up again was about a year and a half later, after shutting down the company. I was sort of felt like I was ready and energized to start my second. And I was really obsessed with the idea around like cybersecurity insurance. Mostly because I felt like I was like, I have a, I think a unique insight here. There's a lot of tailwinds. But again, it was one of these things where I sort of like stumbling into the problem set more through like
Yeah.
discussions with friends than something that had been like a lifelong passion and was about to start it. Had a co-founding team. That co-founding team, for a variety of reasons, ended up falling apart. And so I ended up taking this role at Coastal Ventures. It was originally supposed to be like a, sort of 1 year role, come in as a chief of staff, but use that as a like, sort of landing ground to, sort of build up the idea, the founding team that I do want to, sort of pursue. And about 6 months into my time at Coastal Ventures, I ended up stumbling across a founding team that was working on cybersecurity insurance, same idea that I had. But this team was all like the like ex-Israeli cybersecurity unit. And I had this moment of realization listening to their pitch where I was like, oh, this is what like a world-class team looks like pursuing this problem set.
Right.
Dear God, the team that I thought that was pretty solid pales in comparison to this. And I was like, it was like flip of a coin, if that founding team had like worked out versus it falling apart. And I could have been my next like 5 to 10 years competing against this like Israeli team that would have just kicked our ass entirely. There was no chance that we would have been able to beat them. And so at this moment where it was like, dear God, I can't believe like I had a 50% chance of wasting another like 5 to 10 years with like the wrong team, wrong idea, etc. I really got to be way more careful in the future, when I think about what is the sort of company that I want to build. And so in some ways, sort of, yes, I've been a, sort of VC now for, sort of 7 years and a quarter roughly. But it has always been with the intention of, using this as a, sort of perspective and viewpoint on or place to build companies from. And I, bid my time. And so, that was a year and a half, from sort of when I, sort of shut down the first company. When I finally, sort of pulled the trigger on Varda was actually about 4.5 years, basically, sort of from when I shut down the first. And so it was a, 3-year gap from the realization that I had the wrong team for the cybersecurity insurance. And, when it came to Varda, it was just very clear, okay, this is an idea that I've been passionate about for like, almost 12 years now. And so it's something that I've thought about quite deeply. I actually have the team that I don't think anybody else can form a better team than what we have. We have myself that is, sort of, been thinking about this idea for so long and relevant to the like, sort of CapEx intensive nature of this business. And so it's helpful to have a VC as a co-founder. And then we have a, sort of ex-SpaceX, sort of engineer and leader that was, predominantly focused on the exact sets of problems that we'll have to, sort of solve and is going to be able to pull a lot of SpaceX engineers from it. And we have somebody that has done in space manufacturing and microgravity before.
Right.
I don't think anybody else is going to be able to pull together that trio. And I can't think of a better, sort of trio that can, sort of pursue this. And so, I think most founders do not have that, sort of a level of quality of answer as to why they're the right ones and why this is sort of their life work. So anyways, long-winded answer, but in some ways goes into a part of the professional experience that we left out.
So it
Go
sort
on.
of sounds like,
Going back to your first company, I think you went to my alma mater, MIT, but you dropped out to start that business. Is that something you would do again? Or now in retrospect, like what do you advise new founders coming up? Should they drop out of college or should they kind of stick with finishing their degree?
I think there's a lot that's, sort of broken with the current university, sort of systems, irrespective of the world of entrepreneurship. Obviously, I'm not sure that they're like teaching you the right things. I'm not sure that the ideologies that they're imprinting on our youth, are the right ones. In some ways, a joke that I, heard last week that, I think is, probably relevant is there's all this concern about, sort of Chinese, sort of students coming to American universities and then exporting, sort of back to China. And, I think more of the fear should be that when those Chinese students, come to American universities, they actually return to China as stricter Marxist-Leninists than when they came. And so that's sort of more problem than the Chinese students coming to the American university. That said, I think I had a relatively, sort of unique pre-university experience before, going off to MIT. I'd actually taken a significant amount of, university computer science courses at the University of Utah, which is actually in the sort of top 10 CS departments in the United States. They were a part of the early internet, especially on the West Coast. It was Stanford, UCLA, and University of Utah that connected on the West Coast for the early internet. And so by the time I got to MIT, I felt like I had done a lot of the, sort of undergraduate courses. My first year and a half, I kind of completed the rest of the undergraduate, sort of higher level courses. I'd been, sort of pretty independent. I had earned, professional software engineer salaries. And so for me, it was sort of a no-brainer where I was like, I think that, sort of marginal opportunity cost in my most risk-taking, highest energy years being spent learning things that I had already learned, when I was 13, 14, didn't make sense. It's not to say that I think there's a, sort of a set of individuals where, doing undergraduate and being potentially, sort of PhDs, sort of could make sense. But I think the issue with the average university student is they are kind of doing it as just like the default path, again, without a lot of, sort of self-awareness or insight as to why they're doing it. But I also don't think that like dropping out is right for like 30% of the like MIT population either. I think there's probably, 15 students a year that, sort of drop out now at MIT to sort of go pursue their own independent project. I'm not saying the right answer is like 500 per se, which is like half the, sort of graduating class, but the probably right answer is closer to like 30 or 40 rather than 15.
What I'm really curious. So I think of all the founders that we've had on here, we haven't really had any founders that have required a ton of capital. Like you're literally doing space manufacturing. Andy, as a former VC, always tells me that big capex companies don't VCs hate them and don't do it. How have you been able to navigate that? Obviously, you being a VC yourself, but I'm kind of curious if that has been easier or harder than you kind of expected? And also with the kind of the landscape, if you look at like whatever the top 10 public companies, like I'm pretty sure like 60 or 70% of them have like a pretty big, decent, like they're either hardware companies or somewhere in between or something like that. So like there's obviously big exits coming here, but like what do you what do you think about that? Has it been as easy as you kind of expected it to be to raise the capital to do these things? Are you an investor in these kind of companies, or do you go to other software? Just anything around that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think there was an intellectual delusion in Silicon Valley through the 2010s that because the, sort of marginal distribution of software was 0, that there would be infinite returns.
Yep,
And it turns out when the marginal distribution cost is 0, the marginal returns are also 0 because, 2 Stanford kids and some AI can compete against, companies that are even, sort of highly funded. And so this is why you're seeing, their, Coach team recently released their, sort of SaaS portfolios growth rates and how it's basically in, sort of free fall. You're seeing that obviously in the, sort of public markets as well. It turns out returns come, from, having an actual, sort of differentiated value proposition, but also differentiated moat. And it turns out mostly software companies have had no moat. I think thankfully, sort of Founders Fund and myself have been, ahead of the curve on this. We've been, investing in capital intensive and
yeah,
capex intensive projects since, basically the founding date of the, sort of firm. Um, and I think, the rest of Silicon Valley is, sort of finally coming around, sort of to that, probably a decade too late. So they're not going to really get to, sort of capture as many of the returns, but, better than continuing to waste funds on, sort of SaaS for plumbers, type companies. Um, and so,
Okay.
sort of, if anything, I would say it's actually, perhaps been easier than I probably would have expected, to, sort of raise for projects like Varda. And I think that's part of what, projects like Varda, are able to generate such, sort of generational, um, let's say, pieces of hardware, potential returns, value propositions, is that it actually, by doing something more ambitious, you actually attract more capital, more talent,
right.
more interest from customers, more support, because it's something that is just seen as deeply, sort of differentiated. And so, yeah, I think, if anything, the fear is definitely there. And I understand why if you're like a, whatever, 22-year-old dropout. Yeah, I'm not saying that it's the easiest thing in the world to, sort of pursue it, but that might be why the, sort of model founder of today looks different than the model founder did in 2004. There are just less of these like, low capex, low hanging fruit that can
Totally.
actually generate generational returns like Facebook was. And so probably the, sort of model founder of the 2020s looks a bit more like, a 30-year-old that has some, sort of experience under their belt, has a unique insight and has a, sort of deeply differentiated, ambitious vision that people, sort of want to get involved in. And so, yeah, I think, multitude of ways that I answer that question, but I think, the sort of simple answer is it's actually way easier to raise for a capex intensive, highly ambitious company than a boring SaaS company.
For those people that are doing that, which firms outside of Founders Fund would you go to try to raise capital from?
Oh man, I mean, at this point, I feel like every multi-stage, multi-sector, investor has launched some sort of, whatever industrials, frontier tech, defense, aero, sort of sub fund. And so in some ways, I'm not sure that there isn't a fund now that is, sort of doing that. So
It's
I don't
good.
know, go look at the, sort of Midas top 100, and probably about 85 of those 100 are now, sort of desperate to, sort of figure out how to, catch up to the idea of a company like, Androl and, try and own 20% of that like Founders Fund does.
What are your thoughts on that,
I
Andy?
think
Come on, you've been telling me the opposite, that it's so hard to raise capex intensive
I've
businesses.
never told you the opposite.
I'm
I've
just
said you
I'm
actually
just
have to
giving you a hard
match your
time.
idea. You have to match your idea to the actual capital partner you take. So you can't delude yourself into thinking you have a capex light model and to find that software investor who wants to believe it's a light model. You have to understand how much capital it actually takes to achieve a light model. And I think that's exactly what our guest here at this problem.
And Nanit must have been, pretty capital intensive to get it to where it is today, right?
90 million raised for X amount of revenue. So I would say no, comparatively to what so many of the founders out there wasted their money on.
Yeah.
we don't have chefs at the office and stuff like that. And
Right.
that's one way to save money.
But
But yeah, we
when
had
you
upfront CapEx costs, very different than we could never get ramen profitable as it's never, we needed 10 million to bring a product to market. That
Yeah.
is what it takes to build a product-based company.
So you did it.
And
90 million is very thrifty, but that 90 million mostly probably went into developing the technology, right?
I, that's another conversation, given it's an ongoing business. So how much is in
Come on, give us
marketing and how much is
details.
in technology? But yeah, there are real costs in making hardware. No one will hide them. There are real CapEx. And this was 10 years ago before we had 3D manufacturing and 3D printed mold and stuff like that.
Dillian, how do you split your time? I'm just so curious about this. You being a legit partner at Founders Fund, and you're running like a massive company as well. How do you do it? And also, you're a young parent as well.
Let's not forget, like, sounds like a pretty involved dad. Like, you want to be a hands-on parent that's there for your child. Well,
Yeah, I mean, obviously, sort of having a multitude of sets of responsibility and being involved dad, sort of comes with trade-offs, and a lot of that has come from, ultimately, sort of, let's say, social life with friends or, video games on the weekend. All that stuff gets, sort of eaten up by, sort of family and work nowadays, but, sort of not the worst, life change to happen. Um, I think a part of what enables having the multitude of responsibilities is obviously like getting to be a part of a platform that is highly supportive of that, right? I'm not the only, sort of partner at Founders Fund that is involved in a multitude of activities. Obviously, sort of Peter is, sort of constantly involved in, sort of net new, sort of companies and sort of various projects. Our general partner, Trey Stevens, obviously a co-founder,
Yep.
of Andrew. And so there's, plenty of precedent and support for the, way that I've structured, my role. The time, definitely ebbs and flows, but, let's say in the like, sort of post early R&D, and now that we're, really, sort of scaling up our, sort of go to market and have product market fit, I probably estimate over the past 2 years, my time at Varda has been on the order of like 85%.
Oh.
That said, even spending, sort of way less time on Founders Fund, I'd actually argue that the, sort of quality of my capital deployment, decision making, IR, and so in some ways is sort of massively actually improved, despite the sort of reduction in time. I think that sort of comes for sort of a multitude of reasons. One, I actually think VC is a terrible job to do, sort of full time. In that, what ends up happening
Huh.
is you end up sort of having a vacuum of sort of time, or that you either end up going on Italian vacations, or you end up just spending time with entrepreneurs that are probably not worth necessarily your time being sort of spent with, and so you delude yourself into, well, I've met 100 founders, and this sort of founder is sort of pretty above average or in the 25th sort of percentile. But if you actually only spent time with 25 of those sort
Right.
of founders, and really was trying to focus on the top sort of 2 or 3, the 25th percentile wouldn't necessarily make sense to back. So I think there's actually like in some ways in the first year I think it makes a lot of sense, but in the sort of second, third, fourth years of being a VC, I'm not sure that sort of infinite time with infinite founders makes sense. So one, I think constraints on time really force you to sort of prioritize to the sort of generational companies that really are going to matter the most. The second is also just the number of sort of founders that want to work with me that ping, so top of funnel, but then as well as sort of we've decided to work together, decide on sort of taking my capital over anybody else's. All of those things have basically sort of massively improved. I think just more differentiated sort of value prop, and then ability to diligence. Like there's a significant set of sort of companies that I've invested in over the past couple of years where my valuation has been they've been a vendor of Varda's, or Varda is a customer of theirs, or they're going to be a customer of
Right.
Varda's, and ability to diligence and understand the founders sort of former network from working at SpaceX is far faster, and I can do that on in the order of like hours versus a traditional VC probably taking weeks to figure out those types of sort of references, and have a much more intimate and sort of closer to the bare to the metal understanding of the sort of problem set that they're tackling, value proposition they're providing to customers. And so it's not to say that obviously it comes with trade-offs on sort of both sides, but I think on the Founders Fund side it's actually been strictly sort of net positive. And then on the Varda side as well, there's just a set of activities, that have been highly valuable to the company that I wouldn't have been able to do with the sort of Varda hat alone. Probably one of the easiest examples of this is this forum that I've been sort of co-organizing with Jacob Hellberg and Christian Garrett called the Hill and Valley Forum. We're on our sort of third year of this now, and it's sort of become the top gathering of sort of defense tech and aerospace sort of CEOs, alongside some of the most sort of prominent legislators and policymakers in Washington D.C. And I'm not sure that that's something that I could have really had the latitude to co-organize if not for the sort of Founders Fund hat. But at the end of the day, when I give my sort of speech on stage, I do it with both hats on, and I definitely sort of talk about Varda. And so the relationships that I've had with sort of legislative officials, I think would not be possible if not for sort of Founders Fund. So yeah, definitely it comes with trade-offs, and I think the unique set that I have does really make it a win-win on all sides. It's not to say that that's always the case when you have this type of sort of split focus, and so you better have a strong answer as to why the split focus is really worth it for both sides.
You mentioned that the type of founder has really changed. What did you kind of mean by that? And maybe that's over the last like decade or something like that. But I know that like there was a lot of people have this conception of the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world that kind of built something from their dropped out of school and built something from nothing and not a lot of experience and how has that changed maybe the perception or actually in reality, and then also like what do you see as like the most successful companies, like kind of maybe the makeup of them?
Yeah, I think it's something that we thought about a lot internally. In that sort of historically, we've definitely, and I think Silicon Valley more broadly has had an obsession sort of with youth since the sort of Zuckerberg era.
Yeah.
But I think if you look at companies that have been founded in the last, call it like 5 to 7 years, I think there's actually extremely rare exceptions where the founder has been under 25.
Right.
And
Great.
in our now, as far as we can tell, the only one is basically Alexander Wang, Scale AI. And so I do think, that's indicative of the level of competition that's come into the sphere, right? The amount of, sort of VCs focused on funding these types of startups, the amount of founders that are coming into these fields. In some ways, when you increase the competition, it's harder for there to be low-hanging fruit. Take like, consumer social as an example, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, in sort of 2002, you were talking about your competitors being Friendster, MySpace, et cetera. In 2000, sort of 24, your competitors are now the CCP pouring billions of dollars into like the, most evolved algorithms to, hack into the teenager, psychology of U.S. Americans and, sort of feed them climate porn and, depressive TikTok videos. And that is incredibly effective and very difficult actually to, sort of compete against as a, sort of, dropout founder. And so I think the, sort of prototypical sort of founder DNA has fundamentally, sort of shifted. And especially in some ways, as you start to, approach these categories that are, sort of more, highly CapEx intensive. If you look at sort of this defense industrial base, sort of revolution that sort of happened over the last 3 or 4 years. None of the founders of the more prominent companies are again, these like sub 23, 24-year-old founders, basically. There's, again, extremely rare exceptions there. And so it's not to say that, to be clear, in my personal portfolio at Founders Fund, I do actually still have some of these very,
Right.
sort of
Right.
youthful founders. So to say that you're doing, sort of zero of that. But in some ways, we also have to recognize the reality of who are the profiles of people that are building some of the largest companies over the past, sort of 5, 10, 15 years. Not to say that the past is always going to predict the, sort of future, but you have to obviously, sort of study the past at least.
Right.
I think
I
one of
think
the
to a
things,
large degree, you're describing reversion to the mean. I mean, at the end of the day, historically, venture capital was funding CapEx. You were funding you
Sure.
were funding server build out, you were funding chip R&D, you were funding fab building. And you were typically funding a director at a large company. It didn't successful that dream team that you basically enabled at Varda. And when I did venture capital in 2009, it was still the end of that model. And you almost had a delusion that 30 under 30 was a great thing. And 30 under 30 basically means you're more likely to commit fraud outside of Alexander Wang.
I think one of the other things that comes with, founders being a little bit older is like they're starting companies also during the years where they may be starting a family or raising their family. And I think that's, I know when I started Winnie, gosh, like almost 9 years ago, it was definitely not seen as a great thing that I was in my like childbearing years. I really appreciate that you talk about being a dad. You talk about how that, makes you a better founder, better VC, a better person, and you celebrate it. I wonder, are you starting to see that change, like less of a stigma against founders who are starting or growing or raising families?
Yeah, I think, we'll address, sort of both points. I do want to touch on, sort of Andy's point around, sort of reversion to the mean. I do think there's a, sort of significant amount of that. I'd say there's one portion of that we wouldn't agree with. Folks like Benchmark Capital obviously are believing the reversion to the mean. You should be firing, sort of CEOs as VCs. That's not something we'd be making in relation to reversion to the mean. We will continue to stick to never firing founders, even if others choose to do so. Then, sort of
I won't say anything about firing founders, to be
That's
totally
a little
clear.
low.
That was
Totally.
not my point.
Little gut
But,
punch the benchmark there.
historically, VCs were very well known for, sort of firing founders. Some chose to move away from that in the early
Very
2010s. Some have chosen to revert to that in the, sort of late 2010s, and we will not be reverting to that. In relation to your point, Sarah, I admit that, I am 100% sure that, over the course of your, sort of fundraising with Winnie, I am sure that there were biases that, certain VCs had around, a female founder raising while building a family. I admit it's not something that I think I've, sort of personally faced in relation to, sort of the buildup of Varda. And at least, sort of Founders Fund, I would, generally say, I think we really like long-term thinkers. And there's probably some amount of correlation with long-term thinking and family building. Now, there are obviously plenty of highly successful entrepreneurs that, have weird, family situations or, don't, plan on building a family. So it's not to say that that's like, some super strict guidance, but I don't think it's something that, we see definitely as like negative. If anything, it definitely, sort of positively impacts our, sort of biases or, sort of interest in, sort of backing somebody. And yeah, it's something that I've talked about a lot, sort of publicly. I think, in some ways, I think, for me, building a family it made me more ambitious as a founder. I think a part of it is just because you start to, I think if I were to critique the V1 Dillian that, focused on Nightingale, he was overly focused on, sort of societal expectations, wanting to meet the moment, et cetera. Sort of the V2 Dillian, sort of working at Varda, in some ways could care less about, sort of societal expectations and, sort of the status or, sort of feedback from others. Because at the end of the day, I'm like, no matter what happens with Varda, I have been successful in life because I have a happy marriage, a beautiful wife, and a beautiful child, and I get to go home to them, sort of every single evening. And in some ways, that ungates you to be willing to say what you truly believe and take really, really big swings. And I think it's actually what's really necessary for these types of, sort of companies. And so, I think, having, sort of, my first child and building my family has made me in some ways, sort of far more ambitious because I no longer, sort of tie my success in life just to the success of the company. And that makes you, I think, even more, sort of, even less, let's say, sort of risk averse, which is actually pretty critical to, I think, building these types of large companies.
Right.
An interesting point. I mean, when again, if we think about reversion to the mean, because of the age factor coming into play, you're going right back to most founders were family members, or parents rather. Historically, I mean, it was an older, you didn't start a company at 22, you started at 35.
Yep.
And I think like, if you marry well, which I think is one of the most important decisions to, sort of make in life, I think that type of life partner can be, sort of incredibly, sort of critical to your startup's like success. There are a lot of times in, sort of Varda's life that were a particular inflection point where, I really relied on my, sort of wife's feedback and advice and, sort of guidance because she knew me better than anybody else and has a, sort of set of, context and understanding of me that nobody else has, not my board members, not my co-founder, not the people that I work with, sort of day to day at Founders Fund. And so,
I completely agree with that. I ended up recruiting my husband to join Winnie. So now last 2 years, part of a team, which has been amazing.
Well, he's not just part of the team, you're his boss. So that the full cap.
My co-founder is his boss. I get to work on
Keep
product.
it separate.
I want to hear this topic.
No one when he listens to me anyway.
I should get rid of all of them then.
Dillian, what do you? I'm really curious because again, we don't. We haven't had a lot of like just software, pure software plays, founders on here. So for the people who are building like long term, like either deep tech or something that you're not going to get a customer for like the first few rounds or something like that. How do you either fundraise based on different milestones, and so fundraise on that, but also create those milestones internally for the team? Given that, like for you guys, I'm pretty sure you have your first customers, but are you totally live with them yet, or you're still doing testing?
Yeah, I guess I would disagree with the characterization in that I think, sort of CapEx intensive businesses are the attractive ones to fund, but there's also some limitation on sort of how far out that CapEx should be having a return. Like,
Sure.
it's not to say that Founders Fund is interested in, funding lunar ice mining today. not saying that lunar ice mining might not be a commercial venture, sort of someday, maybe even a decade from today. But, the, sort of rough framework that I tend to give to people is, if you can't, sort of be generating significant revenues in year 3 of your company, what is the likelihood that you're going to be able to generate, sort of ultimately returns for the LPs of the sort of VC funds that are investing into you over the 7 to 10 year time frame, given that you at some point need to provide that liquidity. And so, no, Varda has significant revenues, and we have a multitude of customers that we're sort of serving and sort of very sort of live with. This year, we're going to be recognizing about 11.5 million in revenue. That is probably significantly larger than 95% of the sort of SaaS companies that started in the same sort of month or year that Varda did. And so, we keep a pretty intense focus on, of the things that we fund that are capital intensive, do they have an ability to sort of generate significant revenues in the relatively near term? Now, I'm not saying it's like SaaS where you can do that in month 6 or year 1, but it's not to say that also I think that we sort of fund things that can't generate significant traction in a shorter time frame. Now, for some things, it may not be like literal revenue, but signed contracts, indications of intent, et cetera, that have clear translations to ultimately being able to at least potentially provide liquidity in that sort of 7 to 10 year time frame. Now, again, I'm not saying that you have to provide for liquidity in that time frame. We've obviously been now investors in SpaceX for over or effectively almost sort of 20 years at this point. So we're very sort of long term investors. But even in the sort of 7 to 10 year time frame after investing in SpaceX, it was very clear that they had a large set of investors, and if we wanted to have liquidity, we could have. We've obviously just believed in the company and chose to hold.
Or like with your LPs, if you have a 10-year fund and you want to keep your investment in something that longer than that.
Unlike the sort of majority of venture funds in sort of Silicon Valley that are largely optimizing for AUM and really only make any money off their fees because they don't generate returns for their investors and ultimately don't make sort of carry, we actually have amongst the highest sort of GP sort of contribution to our funds, and so we treat it as sort of managing our own sort of capital, and so I think our LPs give us a significant amount of latitude sort of because of that, and so we've obviously had to go back to our to LP committee to get these approvals, but ultimately they've been highly aligned with our sort of viewpoints and being long-term investors, and that even 7 years into the SpaceX sort of investment, it was still one of the best sort of assets to continue to hold over the next sort of 7 years.
I want to take it a different direction. I want to go a little bit back towards what we were talking about before, the early days of Varda. My always assumption was the way a company like Varda started, and I watched it from afar. I know nothing about it. My assumption was you had some LOIs, or at least you had some interest of NRE or something like that at the time that you went out to raise capital, or at least a line of sight on that revenue path. Because I think Kevin's question was almost assuming that it didn't have a line of sight. Is that correct? Did you have a thesis? You knew the customers, you understood where the revenue would come from, and somebody was basically matching capital to a duration of R&D?
I think, I have not seen in any of our capital intensive companies having that level of clear path at the seed round per se.
Right.
I think with these types of, sort of products that you're delivering, they are just more complex in some ways than, again, a piece of software. And so the ability to without any funding, actually get a customer commitment, I think is almost impossible. But there was clear, let's say, sort of idea maze, sort of thought, to use this sort of Chris Dixon, sort of term and framework that was very well thought out and how you would sort of get there. And then you definitely have that, sort of by the Series A. But I would say it's also not that, so unreasonably different than, even like SaaS companies. It's not to say that even like the SaaS companies had pre-commitments from customers, even at the seed round, right? Most of the time it was a product vision with a thesis on why customers would basically find that valuable. And so I find that to be, sort of relatively similar. And then, Series A at a, sort of SaaS company might be, hey, we have $1 million of ARR is maybe the whatever, old school framework. And maybe that's what we're, sort of going back to. And I think that's not necessarily quite the case in sort of CapEx, sort of intensive companies. The likelihood that you're literally flowing revenue at Series A is more, sort of atypical. But at that point, you do have clear, firm, fixed, sort of, commitment, sort of from customers. Varda definitely sort of had that at Series A. We had a, sort of $2 million contract with the DoD that clearly was a path to something, much larger over time. And most of our sort of capital intensive companies have had something like that. But that bar at the seed round feels a little too high across both categories and types of companies.
You touched on this a couple times, but for your type of company, and it seems like there's an increasing number of companies that have to work either with the government or have some sort of influence from them. What does that mean as far as like, is there new roles that are being created within these companies that have like aligned to like for you guys obviously in space and for and defense for like Andrel and stuff like that? Like what are these companies doing to get that connections there?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Sort of Palantir and Anduril, obviously, sort of built up a lot of the framework on both how to interact with the government, but what roles are necessary for startups to, sort of fund in order to be successful in that field. I'll give my sort of kitschy framework that, I think helps lead into, answering your question, which is, if you wanted to, sort of build a company in the 2008 through call it 12 period that interfaced with the government and was highly successful, your founder both had to be a billionaire, and you had to be willing to sue the government, right? Both Elon with SpaceX and Peter with Palantir, both being billionaires, and both Palantir and SpaceX had to ultimately sue the government in that time period to sort of win contracts. So it was incredibly painful. Now they built up an initial sort of framework and success that then allowed in the 2016 through 18 time period, if you wanted to be a founder of a company that was highly successful and interface with the government. Well, now you no longer had to be a billionaire and sue the government. You just had to be a billionaire. And so Palmer Luckey was highly successful with Anduril. And again, that success allowed them to continue to build up a framework for how to be successful with the government that made it so that in 2020, when companies like Varda, Hadrian, et cetera, were being built, at that point, you did not have to be a billionaire and sue the government. Instead, you both didn't have to sue the government, and at this point, you just had to be friends with the billionaire rather than a billionaire, sort of yourself. And so that bar has continued to be, sort of lower in terms of what's necessary to be successful. In terms of the roles that are necessary, yeah, I think Palantir, SpaceX, Anduril, et cetera, have sort of set up a clear framework for this, which is ultimately you need folks in the sort of federal BD role, and there's sort of a clear, now much more clear path on how to interface with the government in terms of stages. The historical, what people would call the valley of death, is a lot easier to bridge now. An example program that we're obviously huge fans of at Varda is a program called StratFi, which took previously the sort of extended phase 2 SBIRs that previously had like a, call it 3, 5, maybe $7 million cap. Now all of a sudden these can be $30 million sort of programs with matching funding from the like innovation department within sort of Air Force, and now other sort of departments within the DoD are basically copying sort of that framework as long as it comes with matching funding from sort of private investors. So even down to the contracting, has gotten a lot more clear to the roles that you need to fill. And then obviously all of these groups have significant, sort of DC presences even from the very get-go. We had our early, sort of, let's say, contract DC lobbying groups within, sort of month 3 of the company. By month 12 or so, we basically had a effective, sort of full-time lobbyist working with us on a contract basis, and then full-time in-house 18 months into the company's life. And so, thankfully, companies like ours aren't having to sort of reinvent the wheel. I don't envy Peter and Alex Karp in 2008 or Elon in 2008 having to, sort of forge this path with, no clear, sort of guide. Instead, the path has been forged for us, and, sort of we just follow their recommendations.
Right.
So you're a multi-time founder. You've done it twice. You've done it very differently. You've gone hard tech versus ramen profitable. What's the biggest lesson you've learned second time go around? What was the most surprising thing this time?
Varda's going to clear 10 million in revenue this year. My first company never got above 100K ARR. It turns out it's actually easier to do the hard thing than doing the easy thing and actually, sort of getting to 10 million in revenue. That's probably the like sort of, simplest, sort of way to answer it. It's like, people are much more interested in being involved in the hard things than they are the easy things. Yeah, to a certain limit, right? Again, where you can't go all the way to lunar ice mining. Nobody, no top tier VC right now wants to fund lunar ice mining, because that's just too hard. That's in the world of state, sort of government to, sort of do the early days of that. And so when you find the appropriately, sort of hard thing, that actually is much easier to build into a big company than the very easy thing.
Well, and also I would think that from a recruiting standpoint, maybe talk a little bit about that. I'm sure you've been able to attract, just by the nature of what you're building, some really like probably awesome people, but maybe people that weren't even in the industry, but it's just like something different. It's like not only for VCs, but like recruiting. I had the same thing over at Shyp. We recruit a lot of people that are like, this is a cool like thing you're doing. It's very unique. I want to be a part of this. You found the same thing with Varda?
Yeah, I will say, sort of credit a lot more to my co-founder than myself. If you look at, sort of the 100 people that currently work on Varda, I can only claim that, so I was leading maybe 4 to 5 of those recruits versus he led the other, sort of 95 ultimately. So, um, but I do think that, both from recruiting from folks within SpaceX that have been, sort of highly successful and could continue to be successful there if they chose to stay. I think a part of why they've been interested in coming to Varda is sort of what was the point of the reusable rockets and, lowering the cost of access to orbit at both Mars, but then also, sort of business cases like Varda that are enabled, and that's been sort of highly attractive. And then, yeah, to people, sort of, let's say, outside of the field, we've been able to recruit top tier pharmaceutical scientists that could have their pick of the litter of, sort of, job offers from
Right.
top 20 pharma that would almost certainly pay way more than Varda, is able to in terms of, sort of cash, but are highly interested in something like this because they see it as a unique, sort of angle, sort of onto their field. And as well as people that have never done anything in aerospace or pharma, at all in their careers, but are still, sort of highly interested in coming to join us. And so, yeah, both in terms of building the business and attracting both investors and customers has been far easier. But then in terms of talent, I think we've never really had a recruiting challenge. Any role that we wanted to
Right.
fill,
Right.
we've filled it in weeks or single digit, basically, sort of months for maybe highly specialized roles where there's a, sort of smaller candidate pool. And I think in some ways that's also, allowed us to have access to such a, sort of wide pool that we've been able to engineer our gene pool, let's say, within the, sort of company in a way that has made it that there's a, sort of very wide set of different perspectives. Like I am a very big believer in, I think a part of what has made Varda highly successful is if you look at our executive C-suite and VP level, there's almost like no overlap in background, family structure,
Right.
composition, beliefs, political philosophies, et cetera, right? Like, yeah, I think one thing that maybe people find surprising is, the person that I probably work with most closely at Varda day to day, outside of my co-founder, our CRO, is like totally opposite on political beliefs for me. He is like a staunch supporter of, Clinton in 2016, Biden in 2020, Biden in 2024, and, has, sort of different beliefs on almost any, sort of, political policy, sort of social topics than I do. It's a part of what makes it so strong is because him and I have to work together day to day and fight things out on like, what our, sort of, congressional appropriations approach should be and who we should be working with and what that strategy should be. And I think if you look at it, across the entire, sort of team, we have, what I always like to call is like real diversity. People think about, sort of the racist version of diversity, which is like focusing overly on people's like skin color or like their gender. At Varda, we have like real diversity. And that word got perverted over the last 8 years. And maybe finally, now that everybody's, firing their DEI department, I will finally be comfortable, saying that I actually believe in diversity and I believe in the like, 2024 version of diversity, not the perverted, last 8 years version of diversity.
So obviously Varda is doing something interesting, and hiring is very easy when you're doing something novel and interesting. People want to join. There's a mission. It's cutting edge. It's frontier science. Now, how the hell did you hire when you're doing ramen profitable? How do you hire when you're building SaaS for plumbers?
Oh, I mean, I'm not sure that I'm the right person to answer that question, but if my answer would be, we stop working on SaaS for plumbers and go do something more meaningful with your life. So, yeah, not sure I'm the right person to answer that question.
What?
One answer.
I guess we never actually even went into what you guys are doing at Varda. I'm actually very curious. So I know you guys are doing manufacturing in space. So you obviously have to launch some sort of manufacturing facility into orbit. Can you kind of give like the kind of
Yeah, and
spiel
like
on that? And is that like a
explain to me like I'm like a fifth grader because that's about my level these days. Like why do things have to be manufactured in space? Like, is it just because it's cool, or there are
second question, is that you see that as the company, or is that like one of many products of getting things into orbit to do other things?
Um, let's see. I think the core vision, the core mission of Varda has been the same, sort of throughout the company's life. The mission, the one-liner, is to expand the economic bounds of humankind, and sort of two key approaches in that. One, economic bounds. If you look at everybody that makes money in space today, it is only done via photons being transmitted basically back and forth. Our core thesis was at some point I need to transition to the world of atoms, and so we're going to work on very high-value atoms, things like the active ingredients in sort of pharmaceuticals. I think the second part of it is humankind, right? To date, everything that we do at Varda, the core architecture, full autonomous, low cost, reusable, high cadence, right? But at some point, as those systems scale, even the most automated pharma, semiconductor, fiber manufacturing facilities on the Earth still require some level of human maintenance. And so as you start to get to enough scale, the marginal benefit of having a human up there helping maintain and operate those facilities is actually better than the marginal cost. And so we will ideally be the first company that is actually having, basically human up in orbit, not because of state-sponsored, basically budget that are ultimately, sort of communistic approaches to, sort of having humans in space. We will be the first, sort of capitalistic sort of answer to why a human is up there doing productive enterprise value, basically generating work. So that's the core mission and vision that is, never changed. I'll, touch on Sarah's question, which is basically, sort of why, sort of do this. I'll provide, sort of a physics-based analogy that will, help you understand the molecular sort of version of it. If I were to light a candle, here on the table in front of me, that if you put your hand above it, you're going to feel that hot air basically from the candle. The reason that you feel that is fundamentally due to the effects of gravity. Gravity is one of the 4 fundamental forces of physics. It affects everything around us. It affects things at the grand cosmic scale, like galaxies orbiting one another. It affects things at the human scale, like a apple falling from a tree on Isaac Newton. It also affects things at the microscopic molecular scale, including the sort of candle. The very simple version of what happens in gravity versus in zero gravity. In gravity, heavier things move down, lighter things move up. In zero gravity, you can have heavier and lighter things in tandem and in conjunction with one another, and they don't move. And so in the example of a candle, when you light it, you feel that hot air is rising, that flame is pulled upwards. The reason that's happening is because the flame basically creates a combustion reaction that creates hot air. That hot air is lighter than the air around it. And so that air basically moves upwards. And so if you actually were to look at the air patterns around a candle in a normal gravitational field, what you'll see is basically this convection pattern where the hot air goes up, cools down, it comes back in, comes below the candle and gets sucked upward. Now let's take that same basically chemical system of a candle and light it in a microgravity environment. Well, you still have that combustion reaction. You still have that flame creating hot air. Because remember, I said in zero gravity, lighter and heavier things don't mix. They don't move around. And so instead, the flame actually forms this perfect sphere rather than basically the air current pulling up the flame like you do on Earth. And it just very steadily diffuses that hot air throughout the entire room in a much more calm and controlled manner. And so when you go down to like the truly microscopic scale at the molecular level, if you think back to like high school chemistry class, a lot of chemistry is basically take 2 molecules, heat them up so that you increase their activation energy and, increase their energy to clear the activation, sort of barrier, and then they lock into place. On Earth, the moment that you do that, if one molecule is heavier or lighter than the other, they immediately start moving around in a very chaotic manner. You do that in the microgravity environment. Instead, they don't move whatsoever, and you can very precisely attach the 2 of them. And so we're not the first to sort of come up with this idea. Top 20 pharma have shown the potential of this. The sort of blockbuster case study from 2019 was Merck actually taking one of their biggest cancer drugs, Keytruda, does $26 billion a year of revenue for them. Financial analysts estimate that it represents about 130 billion of their 300 billion market cap. So it's like, basically half of Merck is because of one drug. They basically showed that because they could do more precise chemistry, they can make a version of the drug that rather than being very imprecise and requires IV drip to deliver to patients to basically mitigate that imprecision, instead, because it's so precisely manufactured, they can just send you home with a syringe that you can be, basically taking in the comfort of safety in your own home. And so we're not the first to, sort of show this potential. We're just helping transition that, basically commercially through our platform. So what is our platform? It's sort of based off of that mission, that vision, and fundamentally that data set that, many people have generated on the ISS. It's allow people to do that type of in-space manufacturing work, but in a lower cost manner. And so what does that look like? It basically looks like a traditional Starlink satellite, but instead of that satellite being optimized for, sort of satellite radios that, can communicate a lot via the internet, instead it's a satellite that is optimized for the basically sort of fabrication of pharmaceuticals. And most importantly, unlike Starlink or Planet or any of these satellite companies, we got to bring the materials back because we can't transmit that data, back, literally bring the drugs back. And so we have these reentry pods that come back. Turns out those reentry pods are also highly interesting to the federal government because when we come back, we transit through what's known as the hypersonic reentry regime. That's highly relevant to, the United States' nuclear defense, basically modernization. Being able to down an ICBM from China requires next generation nuclear and hypersonic subsystems. And in order to be able to develop those, we need to be able to test them. Varda is the only way to sort of test those. And so, if I take my word on it, sort of Director sort of Rumford, who runs the TRMC, which is the Test Resource Management Center for all of DoD, in a congressional hearing when Congress pressing them on why is our nuclear modernization sort of so behind and so slow, he explicitly called out we need more regular and low cost testing. Varda is the only commercial provider that allows for that. And so the same sort of infrastructure and vision and mission that we have, commercially ultimately also serves this federal use case, but as the exact same sort of architecture. And so, what does Varda do? We develop the world basically first in space manufacturing and reentry capsules that bring those back. We use those to both develop sort of better medicines and flight test next generation nuclear defense subsystems.
So I can say for sure, you definitely did not need to finish MIT. Where that, I can now I see why I needed to finish, and you were good with the education you had.
That's
Would have been
awesome.
pretty boring for you there.
Yeah, awesome description.
Thanks.
Well,
I'm mostly curious about lunar ice mining and why you keep bringing it up. And is it fundable?
Yeah, it's an idea that I used as just an example where, maybe slightly less sophisticated VCs that are understanding of this, sort of CapEx time frame to
Right,
sort of real
right, right,
revenues. Right, money is a common sort of mousetrap that people fall into. It's not that I am not super excited or don't believe that one day this will be venture fundable, but the sort of simple answer is if you had a 1-ton chunk of ice in low Earth orbit, who's the customer right now?
Yeah.
There's nobody using right now water at a large scale in low Earth orbit other than basically the International Space Station. I'm not sure that, sort of NASA, sort of makes, sort of sense as being your only, basically customer. And so, once things like Varda or Impulse Space or, SpaceX get further along and there's propellant depots and things like that, now you have much more near-term revenue streams from commercial customers, and it makes sense to invest into the CapEx of lunar ice mining. So it may be that in the 2027, 2028 timeframe, Varda space factories are very large in using water. Shyp has propellant depots that use water. Companies like Impulse Space are doing, sort of regular, sort of in space, basically taxis and use water. And then you now makes sense to invest into that CapEx. And that in a 3-year time frame, you can have real and significant revenues from commercial customers. And so, very excited about it. But it's one of these things where you do have to really pay attention to, what are the near-term commercial customers. And today, basically, the answer is there are none, but that may shift, by 2027.
Very cool. Well, what I know we all have jobs to get back to. Really appreciate Dillian, you coming on, and especially funding these hopefully crazy projects, and you're also doing it yourself. I think that's awesome, and we definitely don't need any more SaaS for plumbers out there. I definitely agree with that. Do you have any parting, maybe one parting words of wisdom for kind of our audience, for just first time founders?
I think, sort of the best words of wisdom that I give to my former self is, focus less on, sort of status and societal expectations and focus more around getting to work around really smart people, because that's ultimately what's going to sort of lead to a great career. I think, so the best choice that I made at sort of 23, 24 was swallowing my ego
Right.
and becoming Keith Boyd's chief of staff. And even though that sometimes meant that I'd have to fetch Diet Cokes for him, to bring to board meetings, it also meant that I got to spend time around Keith
I
and
love
Vinod
it.
Khosla, your call, and David Wyden, and I learned a tremendous amount in those sort of years that then informed my future career, the strategy that I took toward sort of company building. And so I think sort of focus more on the early years around learning from really, really great people and teams before sort of focusing in on what do you want to do to sort of change the world. Versus I think in some ways right now the sort of over obsession with sort of youth and youthful founders has pushed people towards sort of career paths that really don't maybe set them up sort of best for the long term.
Love it. Let's end it on that. Thanks everybody for listening. Thanks, Dillian, for coming on. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.
Thanks for having me.